Hello again. So continuing the last lecture on Gregorian chant and sacred music of the Middle Ages generally. I talked last time about what chant is. It's basically just sort of prayer from the Catholic liturgy that is chanted or sung rather than merely spoken. Talked about the various types of liturgy that exist. Liturgy just means service. We have the office, which is intended for the clergy themselves in particular, and then the Mass, which is intended for everybody. Within both the office and the Mass, we have certain prayers, which may be chanted rather than just spoken, which are proper for certain days within the church calendar, the liturgical calendar. Right? So these prayers change every day sometimes in the church calendar. And then we have within the Mass these 5 core prayers, which are known as the ordinary prayers. And then I talked a bit also about the general characteristics of chant. For example, the fact that it is always monophonic in texture. It doesn't have a beat. It doesn't really have a rhythm other than the rhythm of the words themselves that are being chanted. It is, for the most part, easy to sing because, first of all, it's not meant to be overly flashy. It's meant to be sung by people who might not necessarily have a lot of vocal training. So it tends to be within a limited range, and it tends to move stepwise within that range. Not a lot of leaping around. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, first of all, the notation of chant, that is the writing down of chant, and also about what chant kind of develops into, sort of an offshoot of chant, which is the first type of polyphonic music that we know of, called organum, which is based upon chant. All right. Now, interestingly, both of these things, that is the beginning of the writing down of chant and the beginnings of organum, the earliest type of polyphonic music, which is based on chant, these happen around the same time, as far as we know, around the 800s. That is the 9th century AD. Now, the chant itself goes back much further than that, but as the book mentions here on page 48, at first, Gregorian melodies were passed along by oral tradition. That is, they were just passed along by ear. Let's say you were a young monk in a monastery. You would be taught these chants by your older brother monks, and just through sheer repetition, you would come to learn them all. But there are new chants being added all the time, and eventually there are just too many to memorize, even with the fantastic powers of memory that medieval monks and other medieval people generally had. Remember, this is a time when most people can't write or read, and that means you can't write stuff down so that you don't have to remember it. And because of that, people tended to have actually much stronger powers of memory in the Middle Ages. They could memorize more stuff than we can today, just simply because they had to. Nonetheless, there were so many chants eventually, probably by, let's say, the 800s, that monks started to make little cheat sheets for themselves. They would write down the words to the chant, and they would indicate with little dots roughly where the melody was going up, where it was going down, etc. As time passed, someone got the bright idea, well, instead of just having these dots that show relative position, high and low, we should have a line in there that stands for some certain pitch. Let's say C. And that way we can see if there's a note right on that line, it's C. If there's a note just above the line, it's D. If there's a note just below the line, it's B. You get the idea. Eventually, this was expanded to 4 lines. And then finally, the final phase, which is what we have today, 5 lines in the staff. So it was a gradual process, and it just began of necessity from the fact that there were just so many chants to try and keep track of. And it seems to have begun around the 800s. That is, as the book says, the earliest surviving chant manuscripts. That is, the oldest manuscripts, that word literally means handwritten, the oldest manuscripts of chant that we have today. We date these things, we can tell they came from the 9th century, the 800s. Now, I'm going to skip over a few pages because remember the book goes back and forth between sacred and secular and then back to sacred. I'm going to get to secular music, non-church music, in a future lecture. But what I want to do is skip over to the section where they start to talk about organum, and this is on page 76, if you have the 9th brief edition. It says here, the development of polyphony, organum. Okay, well, polyphony is just another way of saying polyphonic music. Polyphonic is an adjective. It means having 2 or more melodies going on simultaneously. And remember the idea of polyphonic texture, which we learned in the last unit, is that not only do you have multiple melodies going on simultaneously, but each melody is considered to be of equal importance with the others. So you don't really have one main melody. You have multiple melodies which are of equal importance to each other and are also, hopefully, independent of each other. That's what polyphonic texture or polyphony means. If I take that word polyphonic, which is an adjective, and I take the IC off the end of it and put a Y there instead, I get a noun, polyphony. All right, so now the book is talking about the development of polyphony, which is a major development in Western music. Because remember, Gregorian chant is monophonic. We only have a single line of melody at any given time. But Gregorian chant evolves into a different type of music, the earliest type of polyphonic music that we know of anywhere, not just in the West, but anywhere, which is called organum. By the way, the term organum, the book doesn't mention this, but it has to do with organizing. It's the same root. So whoever came up with this term said, well, organized music, or organum, is music where there is more than one melody going on. That's why we have to organize these melodies in some way. Okay, so first sentence in this section, it says here, for centuries, Western music was basically monophonic, having a single melodic line. But sometime between 700 and 900, that is right around the same time when the chants first start to be written down, instead of just passed along orally, let's say roughly the year 800 or so, sometime between 700 and 900, the first steps were taken in a revolution that eventually transformed Western music. Monks in monastery choirs began to add a second melodic line to Gregorian chant. In the beginning, this second line was improvised, not written down. It duplicated the chant melody at a different pitch. Okay, so this is actually very simple. This is the kind of thing that people do when they harmonize a melody all the time. Let's say you've got a pre-existing melody. Well, instead of having everybody sing that same melody, what if some people were to sing a parallel melody at some regular distance or interval away from it? Right? And who knows how this came about? This is something, again, that started happening 1,200 years ago. Maybe just some monks got bored of singing it the same way all the time. And someone got the bright idea, well, how about if, okay, half of you guys sing it down here where it was originally written, and half of us will try and sing it, let's say, a perfect fifth away. And we're going to maintain the same shape of the melody, but it's going to be a fifth higher. Right? And we're going to form parallel fifths. This is the beginnings of organum, the earliest type of polyphonic music. And you can see an example of it here in the book. Again, if you have the 9th brief edition, they show just a short segment of a chant which has had a a melody added to it. This second melody, by the way, we have the original chant, and then the melody that is added to it is called the duplum. The same way that we use the word duplicate. It duplicates the shape of the original melody, but it is at the interval of a fifth away, so we have parallel fifths. There may also be a third added layer of melody called a triplum, and that will usually be an octave away from the original chant, an octave higher. Okay, so this is the beginnings of organum. It says medieval music that consists of Gregorian chant and one or more additional melodic lines is called organum. Now, the only problem with this is if you think back to my definition for polyphonic texture, that is, you've got different melodic lines and they are supposed to be of equal importance and they're supposed to be independent of each other. Well, this early parallel organum doesn't really quite meet that definition because the melodies aren't really independent of each other, for one thing, right? You've got the original chant, and then the added melody is not independent. It just follows at a regular distance away. It's moving in parallel motion with that original chant. And also you could say they're not really of equal importance either, because the chant is what determined the profile of the additional melody. So we could say, well, the chant is really the important melody here, and the duplum or the triplum are just harmonizing the chant. Clearly the chant is the main melody. So you could make the case that the earliest type of organum, the type that evolved around the year 800, doesn't quite meet this strict definition of polyphonic texture. But there is a later evolution. Organum is not just one thing. It starts out with this very simple, primitive, parallel organum that I just described, but over the course of hundreds of years, it evolves into something much more sophisticated that really is truly polyphonic. And the book talks about this in the next couple of sentences. It says here, between 900 and 1200 AD, organum became truly polyphonic, and the melody added to the chant became more independent. Instead of moving strictly parallel to the chant, it developed a melodic curve all of its own. Sometimes this line was in contrary motion to the chant, moving up as the chant moved down, or vice versa. The second line became even more independent around 1100, when the chant and the melody were no longer restricted to a note against note style. Now the two lines could differ rhythmically as well as melodically. So here's what they're talking about. Let's take just sort of the two extremes. Now there's a whole process of evolution in the middle, but in the very beginning days of polyphonic texture and organ, we have this very strict, simple parallel organ. You've got an original Gregorian chant down here, and you add a line or two above it, and those lines follow in exact parallel motion. But as time goes on, what happens is, let's say fast forward to the year 1100, 1200 or so. Composers start to take that original chant and stretch out the time values of all the notes. So a note that only lasted, I don't know, for a tenth of a second might last for a full second or two, right? So the notes themselves are going to be held. The notes of the original chant are held for a long time. And above it, the additional lines of melody will move much faster than the chant. So the chant, whoever is singing the chant, the original chant, is holding notes for a long time. That guy, by the way, and it's going to be a guy if we're talking about monks, comes to be known as the tenor. That's what tenor means. It's the same root word as tenacious or tendon or tenant or tenure. It has to do with holding on to something. The Latin root, ten, means to hold. Tenare is the Latin verb to hold. So a lot of these words that have to do with holding something, like your tendons hold your muscles to your bones, and a tenant is holding an apartment, right, that is owned by the landlord. And the landlord owns it, but the tenant holds it, right? It's lots of different words with that ten. The tenor is just the guy who is holding the notes of that Gregorian chant, the original chant. And the upper parts now move faster and independently of the chant. And as that happens, not only are those parts independent, but the chant, which remember was supposed to be the most important part, right? The chant starts to sound like a kind of like a background accompaniment. Now, the chant is so familiar to the people who sang it and the generations who sang it day after day over hundreds of years. The significance of it was still there, and it was still certainly recognized. But by using the chant as sort of a foundation, by stretching out the notes of the chant, and then placing faster moving melodies on top of them, naturally your ear is going to gravitate towards the faster moving melodies, right? And you're not really going to hear that chant as a melody at all anymore. It's going to seem like kind of like an accompaniment, actually. I'm going to put an example, I'll put an example on D2L, and I'll put an example of actually maybe both of these different types of organum, parallel organum and what is called florid organum. That's the later evolution, where we have the chant in these long held notes and the upper parts moving faster and independently from not only from the chant but also from each other. This is when we get to true polyphonic texture. And this type of chant of organum, as I said, is sometimes called florid organum. The word florid simply means flowery. It's more complex, it's more flowery than plain old parallel organum. It's also sometimes called Notre Dame organum. It's called that because the two greatest composers of this style happen to be music directors at Notre Dame Cathedral. They were almost certainly priests also. But we just happen to know about these two choir masters or music directors at Notre Dame Cathedral who were active there in the late 1100s and early 1200s as the cathedral was being built, actually. And of course, I'm talking about Notre Dame of Paris, which so sadly went up in flames not too long ago and is now being rebuilt. In talking about Notre Dame and the Notre Dame style of organum, what the book does, it talks a bit about these composers and about Paris generally in the late Middle Ages. So I'm going to try and connect all these various threads. So Notre Dame Cathedral, of course, is in Paris. It was built actually on the site of an earlier church, which was built on the site of a Roman temple, because Paris was once a city in the Roman Empire. And this new cathedral, it was new in the late 1100s, was built in this brand new architectural style called the Gothic Style, which was a huge advance over the older Romanesque style. And if you want to see an example of that, actually, in your textbook, if you go back to the pages on the sort of historical background of the Middle Ages, that is page 60 in the 9th brief edition, there's a comparison between a Gothic cathedral on the one side and the older Romanesque style on the other side. So So check that out. Notre Dame was among the first Gothic cathedrals. It was a huge advance in architecture over the older style, and it proves, by the way, that first of all, people's idea of the Middle Ages, that there was no progress, that there was no art, there was no beauty. That's nonsense. There was progress, there was beauty. It just happened at a slower pace than it did later on. Anyway, the fact that we have this new style of architecture in Paris, the fact that we have this new cutting-edge musical style, organum, being composed by these two choir masters working at Notre Dame Cathedral, the fact that we have the first university. Now, the Italians will say actually the University of Bologna is the first university. The French will say, no, the University of Paris is the first modern university. And they will probably be fighting about that for a very long time, for another 1,000 years. But nonetheless, the University of Paris was certainly among the very first universities in the world. And all this adds up to the fact that Paris, in the later Middle Ages, let's say in the 12th century, was sort of like the place to be for intellectuals, for architects, for musicians, for a lot of different people. It was sort of like the unofficial intellectual, cultural capital of Europe in the late Middle Ages. And definitely, if you were forced to live back in the Middle Ages somehow, but you could pick when in the Middle Ages you could live, definitely go for 12th century Paris. It was an amazing place, lots of things going on, among which was the first truly polyphonic music, that is, Notre Dame Organum. Now, the book talks about the school of Notre Dame. By that we don't mean, let's say, like a school like the university. What they're talking about when they're in this context, the school of Notre Dame, are the composers Léonin and Perrotin, these two choir masters slash priest slash composers who composed in this style. Now, they are certainly not the only two who composed in this style. It's just that we know a little bit more about them than about others because they had such a prominent position in this very important cathedral, in this very important cultural center of Paris. And one of the things that makes Notre Dame Organum so important, in addition to the fact that it's really, you could say, the first truly polyphonic music, is that it is the earliest music that we know about where the rhythm is precisely measured and indicated in the sheet music. Now remember, Gregorian chant, strict Gregorian chant, is monophonic and it doesn't really have a beat. And for that reason, you don't really need to write in rhythms. You might need to write in pitches, right? And I've talked about how the notation of pitches developed with the little dots and with the lines. But I didn't say anything about how the notation of rhythm developed. That's because they didn't really need any rhythmic notation in Gregorian chant. Because remember, it's monophonic. Everybody is singing the same words and the same notes at the same time. So as long as everybody tries to stay together, it's no problem. What I just said about Notre Dame Organum is that we have people singing at different speeds. We have the tenor holding the notes of the original chant for a prolonged period, changing notes only occasionally. And then we have the upper parts, which are moving much faster. And yet they are all singing the same text, the same sacred texts. So we have to make sure that they change syllables and change words at the same time. How are we going to do this? When some people have many notes, are singing melismatically with many, many notes per syllable, and then other people singing the the original chant, who might have just 1 or 2 notes per syllable, moving very slowly. They all have to stay together somehow. How are we going to manage that? Well, we've got to write it down somehow. We've got to come up with a system of rhythmic notation, a way of writing rhythms. And the way that they did that was a fairly simple way, but it worked. They had this system called the Rhythmic Modes. It was kind of like Morse code, the way that it worked. You know that Morse code is made up of just combinations of short sounds called dots and longer sounds called dashes, right? So you've got a short unit and a long unit, and if you put them together in various combinations, you can encode meaning, right? And you can tap out Morse code, and if someone is trained in Morse code, they can understand it. The principle is kind of similar in the rhythmic modes. Each of the rhythmic modes was a sort of a different permutation of a basic short unit and a basic long unit. You had short notes and long notes, and you could put them together in various sort of pre-packaged patterns. There were 6 of these different patterns or modes. I'm not going to get too much into detail. I'm not going to ask you to know which mode is which, but let's just say, for the sake of demonstration, mode 1 might be, let's say, a short note followed by a long note. Mode 2 might be a long note followed by a short note. Mode 3 might be short, long, short. Mode 4 might be long, short, long. You get the idea. Once you understand which mode you are in, all you have to do is keep thinking that pattern. You have to sort of mentally overlay that rhythmic pattern over the notes that you're looking at. So at the beginning of a piece of music that is organum, there would be a little sign to tell you which mode you are in. And as a trained monk, you've been musically trained, you know your different modes, you say, aha, I'm in mode 1. As I look at all these notes, I'm just going to think short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. Now this is a fairly limited system. Another way of thinking of it, I use the comparison to Morse code. You could also think of it as being sort of like Legos. From the point of view of the composer who's creating this stuff, imagine that you've got a Lego set. Big Lego set, lots and lots of pieces, but there's only 2 different pieces. There's one of those little square pieces, and you got one of those rectangular pieces. What can you do with just 2 different pieces? Well, actually, you could do a lot if you have an imagination. If you have enough pieces, even with just 2 different pieces, you could do quite a bit. You can make different things if you have an imagination. Now, later we will see how rhythmic notation evolves and gets much more complex, but that's going to be for a future lecture. Sticking with organum, organum used this fairly simple system of rhythmic modes, but it was a major development because, again, this is the earliest type of music where the rhythm was specified, where it was written down. And this is a necessity. It had to be written down because of the fact that this is polyphonic music. And we have different people singing at different speeds in different rhythms, but we have to make sure that they all line up correctly somehow. Okay, I think that's probably a good stopping point for talking about organum and talking about chant. So remember, you can think of, Gregorian chant is sort of like the trunk of the tree of sacred music in the medieval era, and even on into the Renaissance, right? But we have sort of offshoots coming off the tree, and the first shoot, the first branch coming off the tree is organum. This is the earliest type of polyphonic music. Later we're going to see other different sort of branches coming off of this tree. But for a very long time, all Catholic church music was based upon chant in some way. That was sort of the foundation that the composer would start with. and then they would find ways to add things in and around this chant, add other melodies on top of it, for example, in the case of Polyphonic Organum. Keep in mind also there are different styles of organum. So remember I talked about the early primitive style, simpler style, called parallel organum, where the original chant and the additional voices, the additional melodic lines, move note against note. For every note of chant, there is a note of that additional melody, and they move in the exact same rhythm, and they move in parallel motion at all times. But then hundreds of years go by, and we get this final evolution of organum in, let's say, the 1100s, which is a time of just kind of like almost like a little mini Renaissance, right? It's a time of cultural growth and development, when we see the development of the Gothic Style architecture, the University of Paris, okay, and the development of Florid Organum or Notre Organum, so called because it was composed by these two music directors at Notre Dame Cathedral. And in Notre Dame Organum, this later evolution, the chant, the same old Gregorian chants, they are stretched out so that the notes are held for a longer time, and the additional melodies move faster than the original chant. And again, I'll put examples up on D2L and in my saved videos for you to check that out. All right, I think that'll do it for now. Next time, I think I will talk a little bit about secular music of the Middle Ages. And then I'll get to a sort of a separate period unto itself toward the very end of the Middle Ages. It's still within the Middle Ages, but it's a sort of a sub-era right at the tail end of the Middle Ages called the Ars Nova Period. Okay, so that's what we'll cover in the next couple of lectures. See you then.